Hello, I'm Andrew Elliott, and I'm delighted to be one of the invited speakers for the Digra Italia online version of this year's conference. Today, I'm going to talk about the historiographical principles of video games, although we might actually potentially call this the historiographical potentials of video games. On the basis of the arguments I'm going to put forward. And these arguments, I will say from the very outset, are speculative, are born of an attempt to try to think through not any specifically new research, but what I'm trying to think about is the ways in which existing research has moved us to a new area and what sort of new potentials or new principles that might expose in terms of historical game studies, or HGS as it's sort of started to be called. There has, of course, been undoubtedly something of an explosion both in the popularity of historical video games and video games more broadly in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Certainly in terms of historical video games, we've seen the explosion since the domestication of video game consoles and since the kind of proliferation of new strategy games, new casual games that will somehow involve some kind of relationship with the past or some sort of construction. What this means for players, of course, is that the scholars very quickly will follow. And so what it meant for history and historical game studies was until recently less well studied, but gradually beginning with, most people will put the beginning with Uricchio in 2005, and of course McCall's early work in 2012, and so on, and our own work with Matthew William Capel and my edited collection, which came out in 2013. We've started to see a resurgence, or indeed an insurgence of scholars studying historical video games and what that means, and what those studies have done is to shift the emphasis away from earlier questions and into new territory. So that's what I want to think about today, is where that shift has come from, where it's taken us, and what might be something of the future for us. And this, what it means, I'm going to suggest, is that given the kind of the range of historical approaches, so things like beginning with Uricchio talking about simulations, we've moved on to think about things like affordances through Chapman's work and Chapman and Linderoth in 2015. We think about particularly players and modders and their relationships. So, of course, Tara Copplestone's work and Daniel Dunn, Vicky Cooper, and in particular Tom Appley's work back from 2006, as well as his work in 2013. We've also seen a shift away from the games as simply a product to be studied and into looking at developers through Robert Horton's work, Ulfa Grufsted's work, and Grufsted and Fuster's work. We see them being treated through the lens of ideology by people like Emil Hammer. We see them as problem spaces, as Jeremiah McCall interprets them. We see their potential for pedagogy in David Williamson Schaefer, James Paul G, and Harry Brown, among many, many others. We've also seen particular historical approaches which have lent new rigorous and insightful analyses from historians studying those particular periods themselves. So we've seen World Wars I and II in Chris Kemschel's work, or in Salvati and Bullinger. We see the study through the Crusades, particularly in Mike Horswell's work or Susanna Throop's work. We can see the Middle Ages being studied through the work of Daniel T. Klein, who did an important collection. Again, Rob Horton or Vicky Cooper, or Gail Ashton and Dan Klein. And we even see most recently, the work of classical antiquity through Sean Beaver's recent PhD thesis, or early modernity through Tobias Windling and Florian Kirschbaumer in 2014. So what the range and quality of these various studies means is that there are at play a series of highly sophisticated and insightful ideas. And what I'm proposing is that within historical game studies, that means we're both witnessing and necessarily taking part in what is, I think of as a fascinating participatory project, which offers a means of exploring historical engagement through a variety of lenses. So if we see where this work begins, what's been the most significant move I'm positing as my first principle is one, a move away from an accuracy model. And I've written quite extensively about this elsewhere, but I do think it's really important that it's not simply, and I have no intention of setting up a kind of a dialectic between historians and everyone else on the other hand, because that would be to use a straw man argument that very few historians would simply argue on the strength of accuracy anymore. What I'm thinking, though, is the moves away from accuracy and into things like authenticity or player experience destabilizes historical authority. It also fragments and dissolves it into something else, and it's the something else that I'm finding really fascinating. It means that it's no longer simply about authority, but about historical possibility, and that little tweak can actually have a massive potential impact. We see this particularly, to use one simple example, or not a simple example, but to use one obvious example of Adam Chapman's work, where his approach of an ecological approach of affordances has seen a compelling shift, which has moved away from the idea of a history being received to rather think of it instead as one which is continually being constructed. So it's not about the historian's craft anymore, it's about the player's construction of the past through the affordances, which sets about a dialectic between the developers, the players, the modders, and so on. And it kind of, his book, which if you haven't read it, it's in my bibliography at the end, and it's really worth pursuing. The second trend which I'm going to suggest takes place between 2005 and 2015, more or less, and these dates are completely kind of drawn neatly rather than any attempt to be historically accurate. Between this sort of first 10-year period of historical game studies, we also saw, and I participated in myself, the bid for scholarly legitimacy in precisely the same way as we saw with film studies or television studies in the late 20th century. We often see or find perhaps an undercurrent running through a lot of our work in games, in historical game studies, suggesting that it's important, and this leads to the idea that the games are kind of an art form, or games are only useful as a pedagogical tool in order to validate its importance. I think this is fairly obviously flawed as a problem, because it means that if a game has to be serious or have kind of a serious effect in order for it to matter, and my suggestion is that maybe is less important than we otherwise might think. It means that we can't look at things like casual games, as Jesper Juhl encourages us to explore. It also means that a game like maybe the medieval strategy games that you see on Facebook that are clearly based on sort of Farmville and so on, those casual games would be dismissed because there is no suggestion that these will be art forms, but actually I'm suggesting that as a participatory project we ought to look at these games. So that's point two, is that we have this issue with scholarly legitimacy. And what I'm suggesting, and I've suggested in the abstract, which should be uploaded alongside this, is that by fighting off those attacks from historians who lament the absence of historical accuracy, and again, there aren't very many of those historians, game studies has been prevented from growing in confidence on the basis that it must have to insist on the importance of the game itself, and that, I've suggested, actually takes us away or back into the fidelity debate, which is not particularly helpful. If we then move away from the fidelity model and the games as serious art model as the first two arguments I've made, and move into the new territories of where we've started to see historical games, we see in the last 5 years particularly a flurry of absolutely fascinating new work. I'm not going to enumerate it in its individuality. I want to pick out several highlights. So I have sort of 6 highlights more or less that I think are symptomatic of very new and very interesting approaches to medievalism. The first would be in the pedagogical aspects of it. We see there's an article by Stephen Ortega called Video Games Challenge to the Historical Narrative, which appears in, I think, 2015, in which he actually argues, Ortega argues very powerfully, that there is a narrative of history emerging. And this seems like a very obvious point now, perhaps, but it was really, really important when you read it in the context of pedagogy, that video games challenge the historical narrative, and I'm quoting, by allowing a player within certain parameters to construct her or his own version of events and of different historical periods. end quote. And that, of course, that shift, the allowance of constructing one's own version of events and of different historical periods, frees us from the accuracy debate, frees us from the necessity of games being serious art, but actually allows us to understand what they're doing. It encourages a sort of an individual construction of the past, and that then also ties in with other really significant movements in historical understanding. So I'm thinking also maybe in Samuel Weinberg's arguments about historical thinking in his book Historical Thinking and Other Unnatural Acts, where he talks about trans-historical thinking being much more a kind of a long view of history and a long view of the past, which sees us at the end of it. And so those 2 points, I think, work together as 1 and 2. First of all, the individual customization and construction of the past. The second, the ways in which that will both be informed by and necessarily inform historical thinking. The third is also about customization and changes in thinking, and that's Thomas Appley's work that I have mentioned before, Thomas Appley talking about modding in particular. And I think the modding is something that still needs some work, but is really, really a fascinating concept when we think about it in terms of historical construction, because what happens when we open the toolkit to historical understanding? And some of my practical projects have been trying precisely to do this. So I'm working currently on a project with the National Trust in the UK, where we are opening up what I've called the Historian's Toolkit and allowing a participatory storytelling approach to Alderley Edge, just outside Manchester. If you're interested in that project, you can follow Invisible Alderley on Twitter, and you'll see what we're up to there. But that third project is continuing this idea set in motion by Appley's questioning about modding, and I think modding is one of the future elements there. The fourth is simply to mention 2 people whose work I think is massively important and set to be important, is Ulva Grusted and Tara Copplestone, both of whom are working on exploring the developer's perspective to historical games, what informs their game design, what informs their thinking, and I think that stands to be a massive intervention into the historical game studies in a way that actually took film studies, say 30 or 40 years to understand, and TV studies has been slightly set aside and it's seen as a sociological impact. I'm really, really encouraged to see historical game studies articulating these developers' concerns from the very outset. So that's my point 4 of a highlight within the field. Point 5 is seeing historians who are very well known for their specific work in a specific historical period, like Susanna Throop, who works on Crusades and Crusade medievalism in particular. Seeing their work being imported into video games I'm finding really fascinating. So Mike Horswell is another person working closely on the Crusades, where we see these little touch points of contention throughout history. And we see that remembered history is a product, as they say, and this is Throop. She says that remembered history is a product, not a distortion of scholarly work. That's in her work on engaging the Crusades. And I want to think about that quotation as a way of questioning how constructed history is, and how we very often see kind of the academic history with a capital H, as Rosenstone calls it, dominating the discourse, rather than thinking that the end result of that history is the history that we actually have now as remembered history. So I find that distinction between history and remembered history really useful for thinking through within the context of things like modding and thinking about developers and thinking about pedagogy and thinking about historical thinking. And the sixth most important, I think, has to be Jeremiah McCall's work on problem spaces, where he thinks very, very carefully about historical video games. And in his most recent article in 2020, argues that video games have to be analysed historically rather than as replicas. And so I'm seeing these 6 highlights as moments that bespeak a much broader shift taking place underneath, much broader shift in the foundations of historical video games, which I'm tempted to align into 2 different approaches, both of which are absolutely necessary precisely for what McCall is calling this holistic approach to video games. One might be called loosely the industrial approach, the developers, the modders, the players, the participatory elements, and the elements, people like Esther White exploring really, really important questions about how the specific video game house will influence the kinds of video games that are being produced, and therefore our perceptions about those games. So on the one hand, we might have industrial approaches, and the second, we might continue to call them those hermeneutic persuasions, or those hermeneutic approaches to video games, the textual analysis, the analysis of the mise-en-scène, or the problem spaces, or the game world, and so on and so forth. Of course, these aren't really separate at all in any way, but I'm suggesting if we see them as two separate movements, we might then be tempted to look at the contemporary mode of historical video games and call it historical games, or HGS 2.0. I'm not really going to do that. I'm not particularly interested in launching yet another terminological debate. But if we did, the reason I'm tempted to call it sort of something like HGS 2.0 is because what I'm suggesting is that then brings us to a precipice. And this is where we are right now, where we move towards this precipice of thinking beyond historical games, but what history actually means. So one of the things with historiography, and one of the things that I've been working on with medievalism as a mode of remembering and separating out the history from remembered history, as Throop puts it, is the moment where we realize that the construction of the past and the public commemoration of the past actually helps to construct the present for ways that or for reasons that we're very much embroiled with right now in this particular historical moment. We see that the history that we see ourselves engaged in, or the history of the present, is actually a logical consequence and contingent consequence of the past that we construct, that we see brings us to this point. And that is what I'm saying, is it's something that's reintroducing the historiographical turn within the game studies. What it allows us to understand is the ideological positions, and again in the abstract I talk through the idea that Emil Hammer has put forward about the ways in which how ideology actually constructs the present. So if we take that particular moment, we're starting to realize we're actually at this amazing point, and this is what I'm really excited about listening to some of the papers and maybe some of the responses here in the DIGRA for this for 2020, is where does that leave us? Where does historical game studies go from here? We are constructing a present in which we are currently living. That then fundamentally causes us to challenge the historiographical principles, and I'm fascinated in seeing where that might lead us. So I think without actually concluding anything, that is simply the conclusion that I've reached. Thank you.